Welcome to the latest episode of Lateral Think, brought to you by Melbourne Athletic Development. Melbourne Athletic Development is a sports and injury management clinic based in Melbourne, Australia. To maximise your performance, optimise your injury management, contact the team at Melbourne Athletic Development. As many of you know, Jack and I have a very diverse understanding across multiple areas of practice, whether they relate to sports performance, say for instance with my background in track coaching, or with Jack and his background in yoga practice. We've combined a lot of this knowledge over time with our clinical and sports performance experiences to really develop what we do. And as you know, we love education. So what we've tried to do is take that knowledge and put it into an online learning community. We think this is important because it's an opportunity for people to interact, learn, and upskill as they try to improve the practice of what they do. So if this is something that you would be interested in doing, head to melbourneathleticdevelopment.com.au/education and get an understanding of how you can upskill your current practice. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Today we are very lucky to be joined by Dr. Shayne Vial. Shayne, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure can. Thanks for having me on, guys. As we were speaking just before, the previous people you've had on have got quite a fair bit of knowledge between them, so I kind of feel a little bit noob in comparison to them, but welcome nonetheless. So thank you. I kind of actually started a career in marketing first. So I kind of went down the corporate route. Was kind of making some good strides there, and then had a bit of a crisis the one day, woke up and thought, what am I doing? This is actually not what I'm enjoying. So moved country. So came over to Australia, started doing my undergrad, sports science. And then, around about my second year, I was doing some volunteering down at the West Australian Institute of Sport under a guy called Stu Little. So
we know Stu. He was part of our
so there's Stu, and then there was Andrew Little. So Andrew Little was probably a pretty big influence. So I kind of went down there, volunteered, did some work with him, and saw what he was doing. And then after the session, I was like, mate, how do I get your job? And he basically said to me, you have to go and get your PhD. And then I was like, all right, cool. So and went down that road, kind of did my master's through a project with the AIS in badminton, which I had absolutely no idea about at the time. So that was a good learning curve. And then I went to Perth Glory Football Club and did my PhD through them. So it was an industry-based collaboration. And I was looking at all things sprint mechanics and hamstring injuries. And then, kind of where I'm at today. As a lecturer, researcher, which is still a relatively new role for me. So I started at the beginning of this year. Prior to that, I was working over east at the Queensland Academy of Sports. So I was working with Athletics Australia kind of athletes, so national-based athletes, traveling around doing competitions for them, kind of reporting data and working as really applied biomechanist. So then found myself up over here, back in Perth. So kind of done a big circle. So kind of ended up where it all began.
Do you have a background in athletics yourself?
Most certainly do not. So I don't know if you can hear, but I'm South African. So we grew up, it was literally rugby and cricket. And my parents are from the UK. So we actually spent a bit of time in the UK. So then it kind of switched over to soccer or football, whatever you want to call it. When I kind of started working in athletics, I kind of was out of my depth. So I really have a lot of any knowledge that I do have kind of owed to the coaches that I worked with some really top coaches that were they just wanted to share their knowledge, and they were really giving with their time and knowledge. So anything I do know, at least from an applied perspective, really comes from those gentlemen over east. So I owe them a fair bit, to be honest. So if they do listen, thank you, especially Paul Pierce. He's a fantastic coach. So
he's a very good man, Paul Pierce.
Yeah, he is one of the legends.
Well, on that, I think obviously, as I said, it was an applied biomechanics role. one of the basic questions that we wanted to put to you, and we have asked people this, but they seem to avoid it in some ways. But what fundamentally to you do you think biomechanics is, and what role do you think it plays in the overall sort of development of sports performance?
Yeah, it's a big question, so I can see why people start to sidestep it a little bit, but I'll do my best not to sidestep it. So, kind of at its fundamental level, you're basically taking mechanical concepts from a physics perspective, and you're just essentially applying it to a living organism. So, whether you're doing more comparative biomechanics in like kind of animal organisms, or whether you're doing biomechanics in humans, it's the same principles, so you're essentially just combining both biology and these mechanics to kind of understand how we actually apply force, how we transfer energy across segments. And I guess biomechanics does go all the way down to the very kind of mechanical nature of how a muscle contracts. But from my perspective, I guess I'm more of a traditional biomechanist in that stage, where I'm kind of looking at someone's movement pattern as a whole, and we're trying to quantify that movement pattern in any way, shape, or form. So, I think it's just marrying those two in a good way, that we don't forget that when we're talking about mechanical or physics concepts, that actually it is a tissue structure underneath it that is probably creating or generating those forces. So we don't want to kind of lose that disconnect. But I think I kind of look at it from a more macroscopic level, and I guess that's just because I've mainly been working in sport. If you kind of start going to kind of microscopic in nature with coaches and conversations, you might lose them a little bit. So I think that's probably where I sit in terms of understanding biomechanics at its fundamental level.
It sounds like you're nicely balanced between those two areas of the biology and the mechanical. How do you, because it's something that I think sometimes gets lost with the people that are a little bit more on the engineering side of things, how do you actually feel that the biology informs the difference between just seeing these physical outputs and just using the numbers from force plates or the data and saying, oh yeah, okay, we've reconstructed this model, the simulation model, and it says that the tendon should do X, therefore off we go. I think as both clinicians, and obviously I am a track coach myself, so I kind of not laugh, but I think that's a bit simplistic to think, that your little model said this, so therefore it works. How do you put the two together? Because it sounds like you're very aware of the fact that there is a biological system you're dealing with.
Well, I think first is to know all the limitations. So especially when we're talking from a modeling perspective, so the kind of musculoskeletal modeling that we do use. So I've also kind of dabbled in this a fair bit, looking at hamstring stuff in sprinting. And you have to know that you're making a lot of assumptions. So, you're making assumptions about pronation angles, you're making assumptions about contraction modes, you're making assumptions about a lot of different things. And we're kind of distilling that down to a relatively simplistic thing, such as does the muscle tendon unit actually lengthen, or is it shortening at this period? And then what does that mean in terms of a contraction mode? Well, again, we don't know. So I think, I just basically try to look at it as a wedge in the pie, really, is that it can tell us some stuff, but it cannot tell us all. So, I guess the answer to it is kind of sitting on the fence a little bit, where it kind of goes, it depends. I think I find that as a very general rule, we tend to talk a little bit more kind of like on the biological side when there is some kind of injury involved. Then we want to go, okay, well, let's look at the tissue quality. Maybe there's some tests that we can do around that, and that's kind of the more of a conversation. And then we jump over more to the mechanics side when we're talking about performance. So those should never really be too separate, to be honest. Of course, the conversation is best when we combine these. They are not independent factors. So, for example, as I've said, if you use muscle contraction mode and velocity, this will impact the storage and release of elastic energy. And, we just observe that from the overall observed joint moments or power that we report. So, I think it's very important that we understand the muscle physiology and never actually forget that. And I think whenever we make any inferences, especially from a biomechanics perspective, we need to remember that we're making these kind of macroscopic inferences, while there are small contractile properties that are actually probably driving this at varying different levels. We know that, for example, muscles do not just kind of activate as a whole. It kind of propagates, and some parts of the muscle activate to a greater extent or a lesser extent. So, I think it's very important to know that. So I'd say kind of the big point there is knowing what the limitations and assumptions are from any kind of measurement that we're doing. So, I tend to be more on the cautious side. So when we look at musculoskeletal modeling, I'm not going to say, hey, this is exactly what's going to reduce or cause injury. Like causation shouldn't really be in the vocabulary.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
On that note, because this is often a debate I have with myself, where if you think about assessing the mechanical components of the human body, we can look at things like, force plates and other ways of measuring and quantifying that. So we can very much look at it from a mechanical standpoint. When you think about what's going on internally, as you just alluded to then, we are making assumptions. And I know for me personally, I quite like reading about that and intellectually exploring it. But then when I think about what I do clinically, I'm thinking of, what's happening with the change of pronation angle or dissociation between the muscle tendon unit. I sometimes wonder, is it actually really of value to me clinically? Should I really just be focusing on the external force application, understanding that that's going to build certain tissue capacity required for that particular sport or task, and not get too caught up in going, oh yes, because this is causing this particular architectural adaptation and so on? What are your thoughts on that?
So I kind of agree with that until the point that we hit injury. So when we hit injury, that's when we start to go, well, we looked at the overall force. We've been training at this. We've been seeing the adaptations that we think, but we've still hit some kind of injury. And of course, we know injury is multifactorial. There's so many things that come into it that a lot of the biomechanics research, we actually never report, like, how did you sleep that night? What did you have for breakfast? All these kind of external factors. So I definitely, I like the fact that we can measure the external force and then therefore have a good idea of what the physical requirements are for a particular athlete. But I think that fundamental level does kind of break down a little bit once we do come up with an injury, because what if we tick all those boxes, and what if we hit all the factors that we think we should be hitting, and then an injury does occur, and it's not some kind of crazy injury. I've often sat down with coaches and they literally have closed the door, and it's just, coach and I speaking, and they'll go, I have no idea what happened. I have no idea what has caused this injury. We've been, monitoring, we've been hitting all the things that we should be doing. And then all of a sudden this injury came out of nowhere. So, I think we still need to have the conversation of both of them. But I think if we're going to be using periodic measurements, I think trying to go down at that real small level is going to be obviously practically quite difficult. We're not going to be able to have a look at pronation angle every other week and see that we're actually invoking any changes due to our training. So I think it's something that we should never forget about. But I think it's something from a monitoring perspective, we probably just need to kind of go at the more macroscopic level.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that you sort of alluded to there is, when do we go into more depth of looking at a particular element, so for instance like muscle, tendon characteristics or architecture, versus perhaps more the breadth of, well, have we actually missed something? Do we need to further analyze their sleep status? Do we need to have a look at certain dietary factors? Are there other, psycho-emotional hormetic factors that are influencing their recovery and their susceptibility to injury? So that's always a bit of a balance in itself, that depth versus breadth approach.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And to be honest, I think you've nailed exactly how you've said it. I have absolutely nothing actually to add to what you've just said. So.
Oh, great. We'll just finish it there then.
I might ask you, because it's something that we talk about, but we're not obviously on the area of research, and I'm sure you'd be aware of the term, say, like biotensegrity. Is any of that kind of concept being developed into some of the models of biomechanical research that are being done? Because you see it get mentioned, but then it starts going out into this weird esoteric kind of theoretical world very quickly. And for someone that's been in that, that bridge between, do you see some of those kind of concepts being possible to be integrated into the biomechanical models that we use for sports performance or even injury?
Yeah, look, I think there's always room for improvement in our biomechanical models. At the end of the day, we're taking things like your muscle activation, your ability to produce force, and then your kinematics, and we kind of pulling all of this into a model that kind of gets scaled to that individual, and then we start making the assumptions. Now, a lot of these models have been validated to some extent, but there is always going to be a point where we go, well, we're never actually able to measure what it is that we're simulating.
Mm.
So how do we then make assumptions about that, about things like biointegrity? How do we then, can we take something that is objective in nature? Because at the end of the day, this is a simulation. So we need to be able to put in some quantitative approach. So my kind of question would be, do you have an idea about what biointegrity would be and what measurables we could actually use that for? And I think we could probably start to look at things when we do a little bit more of a kind of an intervention-based study, which is, I think, where we're going to start going now in the sprint biomechanics world. So we've done a lot of cross-sectional studies. We've looked at, less trained athletes or less trained sprinters versus more trained sprinters. We look at team-based sprinters, team-based sports versus sprinters. And, my research has also looked into how fatigue actually influences your sprint biomechanics. So we've kind of done these, kind of cross-sectional studies. And I think from now we actually need to start moving towards these kind of more intervention-based studies. So, which of these variables that we're currently collecting are going to be able to help us understand whether there is some kind of association with something like biointegrity, for example. So I think that's the way we need to go. I don't think we have a good understanding of what that actually means and which variables or which components of that model would actually make up biointegrity. So I think there's a lot of room to work, and I think the intervention-based stuff is where we're moving. So we have a couple of studies that we're planning with myself and my colleague here is Dr. Daniel Kadlec, which I'm pretty sure Soph maybe actually mentioned on the previous podcast. So we have a couple of studies that we actually want to look at for change of direction stuff, some more acceleration and sprint-based stuff. And we want to look at bringing in some constraints-led approaches from an intervention-based perspective and see what changes. We want to be able to collect the full hock. So we want to do EMG, forces, kinematics, build that all into a simulation and kind of get a good idea of what is actually going to change over time or not.
What kind of studies are you designing? Like, obviously, you've mentioned the running stuff, and there's a big area that we wanted to ask you about. What kind of things are you starting to want to put together?
So Dan and I are kind of going back and forth. So he's kind of more interested in doing the constraint set approach stuff. So, what if we just gave you a cue like you need to keep your center of mass really low as you're doing a change of direction. So we're going to use that as the training intervention, so to speak, and do that over a period, right? So we get some baselines, we get them to do 6 to 8 week training intervention, and then from that we'll hopefully be able to get some of these variables which are actually maybe increasing or decreasing, and we can actually see how that relates to performance or other injury-based stuff. So he's obviously, with change of direction stuff, we're quite interested in ACL injury risk. And then on the other side of it is the fatigue. So, my kind of perception around that is we know that, a lot of the injuries, particularly in team sports, are happening towards the end of, the first half, first quarter, second half, and the later quarters. So we know that fatigue or the acute fatigue that experienced within that match has got something to do with it, but we don't exactly know why or what. So we're not sure how that changes your movement pattern and if that movement pattern is linked to injury or not. So, so with that intervention study, I would really like to include a fatiguing element to it so we can see how your movement pattern actually changes when you fatigue, and then what kind of constraint that we introduce, does that actually mitigate or reduce or change your movement pattern after your fatigue? So I think, as coaches and from an applied perspective, we want to know if the things that we think we are changing when we are giving cues or interventions, are they actually changing? And I think that information is going to be really helpful to coaches, so they can kind of go, well, what works, what doesn't work? And we might actually just be reaffirming what we've been doing for years with coaches, where we just go, yes, coach, you were right. This is exactly what you were thinking you were changing. And yes, that has actually changed. So we're always kind of decades back in the biomechanics field, at least in the track and field and the sprint-based literature. So we're just reaffirming what coaches are already doing, which is kind of cool in a way. It's just, coaches haven't been going down the wrong road completely. They've actually been staying or keeping us employed by giving us some really good research questions. So,
well,
yeah.
You mentioned something there that I think is extremely valuable for us to explore, which is understanding, and I know this is one of your papers, understanding what happens when we say get under fatigue in repeat sprints. Can you maybe describe to our listeners some of the preliminary things that you did find, and then maybe some of the research questions that came out of that you're looking to explore and maybe get an intervention out of with these upcoming studies?
Yeah, so we had one paper that's that was accepted earlier this year that was looking at basically having a look at acceleration mechanics of the first 3 steps. So it was a very exploratory based paper. We didn't want to take a really well-trained set of runners. So they didn't have any running-based training within it. They were just team sport athletes that they were well-trained within their sport, but they didn't have any kind of running mechanics or running training embedded in their training itself. So we basically wanted to see what their natural running technique was, and then how did fatigue influence it. So in research, you have to come up with your hypotheses before you actually run the research. And my hypothesis was, well, they're gonna accelerate, their acceleration is gonna decrease, so they're gonna just run slower, and they are gonna have basically a bit more of an upright posture as they run. So that was kind of like the overall hypotheses, and that was partly correct. So they did kind of have a little bit more of an upright run. We found that from an asymmetry perspective, we saw that both of the lower limbs changed from producing power at the ankle to more about the knee, and their acceleration rate actually didn't change. So I was kind of like rechecking my data. I had multiple of my colleagues look at it as well, and we between us, we kind of went, well, it looks like that's actually correct. So it was actually really interesting. So basically, they changed the way they run. So their running technique changed, but their acceleration didn't. And to me, that was actually quite a novel finding, in the fact that the human body is super adaptable. You introduce some kind of element of fatigue, and your body just goes, right, well, I'm going to kind of reroute the power requirements more towards the knee here. How do I do that? Well, I kind of need to have a bit more of an upright posture. And we're still going to be able to whack that acceleration rate. So yeah, that was really, really interesting. And we've just had one accepted now for the max velocity stuff, which probably is a little bit more interesting for track coaches, or at least for team-based sport coaches as well. So that one, again, was super interesting. So we wanted to, again, have an exploratory-based study, and we had seen a lot of stuff in the literature where people are looking at asymmetry. So they're kind of going, well, let's do your eccentric hamstrings and your Nordics, and we're going to have a look at the force output for each of them. And they're going to take the peak force, and they're going to see, there's an asymmetry. Is that related to injury or performance, whatever it may be? And of course, they found, there's been some systematic reviews that have basically found that asymmetry isn't really a factor. So we were interested to go, okay, well, you've looked at these discrete variables. What about kind of these continuous variables? So how does the way you produce force about each of your joints during your sprinting actually change? So what we actually found was the dominant leg in these team sport athletes. Basically the ankle was the main driver, which, as you can imagine at top speed, that's fairly intuitive. And as they were fatigued, the dominant leg basically just maintained that elastic power at around the ankle. Whereas the non-dominant leg, prior to the fatiguing, they actually tended to flex their hip a little bit more. And what we found is they produced a little bit more vertical force. So the legs obviously are not independent. We're both running in the same direction, but we tended to find that the non-dominant leg was producing more vertical force. So it was kind of helping to kind of get into that flight time for the next step, whereas the dominant leg was producing a little bit more horizontal force. So it seems that they had only slightly differing kind of, how can I say, kind of functions, so to speak. And then as they fatigued, the non-dominant leg basically reflected a little bit more of what the dominant leg looked like. So it kind of reverted from using a little bit more hip flexion to a little bit more ankle power. So we kind of had this asymmetry before fatigue, and then after fatigue, there was kind of way less asymmetry. So the legs became more symmetrical, which again, when I did my little hypothesis statement prior to that, I was like, well, I didn't see any of that coming. I thought it was the asymmetry would be exacerbated with fatigue. So yeah, that was kind of two really interesting studies. It's actually really interesting and quite nice in science when you have an hypothesis and it gets completely disproven, because it throws out your bias and you kind of reset where you are. So yeah, that was really nice.
It's interesting you say that, because we actually just spoke with a researcher named Edith Cowan, and
you might know.
Yeah. He's based in Tasmania at the Tasmanian Institute of Sport, and obviously his
yeah,
work.
he did a really nice paper on movement variability. Yeah.
Which you just provided a good example when you're thinking about outcome being similar, but execution and strategies being different. It's interesting though to think about too, is like what you're talking about there, that to see that asymmetry change under fatigue, because the assumption is to always think the opposite, that you're going to see.
I actually think it makes more sense, to be honest with you, because I think that when you have more, like you're fresh, you have more scope to actually explore movement variability capability. But then once you have to actually cut down on your options, because you're still trying to achieve an outcome, but you've got less available to you in terms of tools in your toolkit. So it actually, I don't know if I'm just making shit up right now, but I think that actually makes a little bit of sense based on what Jake was sort of saying to us. I think that actually maybe fits. So I don't know, it's probably something that you can continue to explore if that's a common occurrence you see across different sports and even say different athletes running at max velocity.
Well, I think the other thing to consider then too is that reflective of someone with good movement variability? Because for the ones who perhaps don't have that sensory motor complexity, do you not see that change under fatigue?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so maybe it's a reflection, as you said, of their actual movement variability capabilities in general. And even I think, it was something we spoke about with Jake, but, is that also related to, say, someone's physical capacity? Is someone who's got very well developed physical capacities able to maintain some of those features under fatigue versus those who aren't, and that's got to do with obviously their overall sport development and all those kind of things. But if you say are very physically strong or powerful under fatigue, can you maintain, say, movement variability? These are questions obviously we don't have the answer to yet, but I think that could be some interesting stuff to look at. If you say profiled and then pigeonholed people into different groups of, like, this was the well-trained, physically strong or physically powerful group versus the undertrained, junior players in the team. What actually happens when you subset those groups? Do they close their variability, or do they open their variability? Does that symmetry get worse, or does it get better? Because potentially that opens up some ideas. We did speak to Jake about this of, does that mean that maybe we see more or less injury risk happen under fatigue? If someone's movement variability closes down, is that a good thing for injury, or is that a bad thing for injury? And I think maybe it varies from person to person based on some of those physical characteristics. We spoke about it before, and tissue architecture and some of the features.
Well, that was my big question was, okay, so the limbs become more symmetrical. Does that mean we just now have a more equitable distribution of forces across the limbs, and i.e. does that reduce injury risk? Or does that just mean that we were loading a particular limb at a particular rate because of its qualities that it actually contains, and therefore now we've changed that it might be now more susceptible to injury? So I think actually looking at that through the movement variability lens is probably our next step. How we answer that is obviously going to be quite difficult, because obviously we can have a lot of variability within each of our joints at any given time. And how do we know what are the the kind of outer bands of someone's movement variability when they're just sprinting in a straight line. We kind of have to introduce some kind of chaos to get where that outer band is of their movement variability, to see kind of where they start moving outside of their band, and now we're moving into kind of the risky world. Or do they kind of just narrow their band even more so that they kind of are staying away from being a little bit more variable? Who knows? It's a big question to ask. One day we'll get there, hopefully.
Continuing on with from the sprint perspective, what do you see? I think it's actually been really interesting because there seems to be much more sprint research going on in the biomechanics world, which is, as for coaches, it's actually very interesting and it's good. There seems to be two kind of major realms happening at the moment. One's on the performance side, and I'm unashamedly a huge fan of some of the work of, say, someone like Ryu Nagahara. And then you've got the other side, which is, I think, more of this really interesting research looking at sprint mechanics and injury, and people like Jurgen Mengush is really having a big influence there. I know he's starting to do some papers as well with JB Moran and these people looking at, okay, what can we actually change injury risk around hamstrings with pelvis interventions and running and all that kind of stuff. So we'll probably try and maybe get onto both of those, but what do you think the current state of, say, sprint running research is like, and is that translating to practice? What are the good parts that are translating, and maybe what are some of the things that people are running with that we don't understand yet, but people are trying to implement, quickly?
Yeah, so I think there's people like Jonas Dodu, who are doing a phenomenal job at translating a lot of the kind of more sprint performance-based stuff into team sports. So, it seems that he's got a pretty good team around him. He's tapping into resources from the research world. So he's basically trying to make sure that from a scientific perspective, when he's making any evidence or any claims, he's got the evidence behind him. So I think he's doing a pretty phenomenal job. So I think what we're seeing is this big kind of drive from technology / research into applied practice. Again, I probably, I don't know if I'm generally quite a risk taker when it comes to going out there and doing stuff, but when it comes to research and things like this, I actually want to err on the side of caution, because I think we need to have a really good first principles basis for our understanding of the physical concepts and mechanical concepts that we're talking about. Because if we extrapolate a variable and then extrapolate again, we've made two very big assumptions, and once you've extrapolated, that variable is no longer the variable you intended it was originally, or was it originally, and therefore it's changed. So the claim that you can make has changed. So I think we have to be very careful. I am seeing a lot of that out in the literature at the moment, and even with the students that I'm teaching, they'll go, I was at this club and they were using this bit of technology, and they said that they were measuring explosivity, and you just go, that's not a variable. So, there's a lot of that out there where it's kind of this black box technology, and they're calculating something, and then they've got a really good user interface, and all of that looks great, and the sales pitch is really great, but from a scientific perspective, it's lacking a little bit. Has it actually been properly validated, and is it reliable? It's a really simple question, but is it measuring what you think it's measuring? And if it's not, well, the claim you can make is not the claim you think you can make. So unfortunately, I do see that as a really big trend at the moment. And research is not always the one to help with that, because sometimes we have partnerships with companies and we have a bit of a bias going into sorting out whether there's a reliable or valid measurement from this device. And we kind of jump into bed with these companies, and we pump out these papers, and it disseminates into the applied practice, and it kind of all of a sudden becomes a truth, and it becomes something that is now all of a sudden a norm, and this assumption is now gone from an assumption to a fact in applied science. So I did find myself working with coaches a lot, and my job was just around trying to help with the education around this. The question was, what are you trying to measure? And then I'd say to them, well, that device is not measuring that, so we cannot claim that. So, yeah, I guess that's kind of the negative side, I guess, in that translation. So I guess that's part of our jobs as researchers and clinicians, is to kind of, we need to have that background to be able to distill what is the right information versus the wrong information. And then in terms of the research from a more positive perspective is, I think the intervention-based stuff is great. So Mendegucci, they're having pretty good efforts in what they're trying to do over there. I think we can try and come up with more robust methods of how we're going to measure these interventions and these outcomes. So I think what they do really well is they partner well with the applied side, so they can get really good numbers. They're getting a good sample size. So I think that's quite a positive thing that's happening over there. So I think these interventions are key, because at the end of the day, we can sit here until the cows come home and make a whole bunch of recommendations because this is what we think we should see, or a bias that we have. But unless we actually see proof in the pudding as to what we've done and what outcomes have actually changed, I think a lot of our sprinting-based claims require a little bit more evidence. So yeah, I think it's not that much of a sexy answer, to be honest. It's not like we're wearing these exosuits or anything like that, but I think we just need to do a couple of things a little bit better. And yeah.
I get in. It's funny because I probably get myself into trouble, and I don't want to get you into trouble with your research colleagues, but I keep having discussions with other coaches and even with people in the sports performance field, because, I think one of the things that got run with quite heavily was the work that was done by Ken Clark and Peter Weyand out of SMU.
Mm-hmm.
And I keep saying, look, I don't really believe all of their data because it's on a motorized treadmill, right? And the way that they actually did, if you actually watch the videos, like, this person's holding onto the rails, speeding their legs up, jumping onto this thing and trying to hold it for 5 continuous steps or whatever it was. And it's like, to me, that is not contextually sprinting. Now, it doesn't mean that the data they collected is completely useless, because it gives you an idea of why someone can run it. I think they got up to 26 miles an hour or something like that. But if you're telling me that they only need to push vertically in the upright phase, then I think you can't interpret that from what they did. Now, I'm not saying that that's not the case from a coaching perspective, but I think that I'm much more comfortable, say, for instance, in a contextual setting, taking the research that's done out of Japan, where they have 50 meters of continuous force plates, probably is more like overground sprinting than jumping on a treadmill that's moving at 25 miles an hour. And you don't have to comment on that if it's going to get you into hot water with.
Oh no, the status quo is something that often needs to get shuffled up a little bit sometimes. And I think as good scientists, we need to go, yes, we got this right or we got this wrong, and I changed my mind. So so even if I say something now that I change my mind that later on, I think that's something we should all be doing. We should be challenging our biases. That's something that Soph actually brings up a lot. So she's one that, if you kind of come in, she'll kind of go, well, why? And, is that your bias? What did you think kind of going on before that? So so I think kind of what you're doing is already good. And I think, we already know if you run on a treadmill versus overground, your mechanics are different. So there's lots of research out there, whether you're doing kind of sub-maximal running or whether you're doing maximal running, that it is going to be different, okay? So there are mechanically different requirements for those. So again, I think like Peter Weyand, Ken Clark, they do some really great stuff, and I think they use some really good models, and I think they have a very, very good understanding of the kind of physics and mechanical components. But yes, I think that research is probably not as applied as what it could be. So that's a limitation of that research. Not to say that research is bad or anything like that. I think their research is actually really good. And then Ryu Nagahara, he has probably one of the best labs. I sit over here really jealous. I want to go over there and collect as much data as I can. And of course, contextually, that has a lot more of a representative sprint track for someone to run over. And if you can collect, 50 meters of force data, well, I've got nothing to say to that. Then, hey, mate, do you want to collaborate? So,
Yes.
yeah, I mean, I just think, again, all research, we make big claims, we make lots of claims, and at the end of the day, all of our jobs is to kind of look at each one of those, contextualize it, take what we want from it, kind of give away the rest, and design some better research and go forward from there. And I think the way to do that is to, you can partner with people like Rio Nagahara, who's got the space, but then you partner with the practitioner as well. Like, I am an applied biomechanist. I feel like I know from a sprint mechanics, I have a fundamentally okay understanding of sprint mechanics, but I need to work with coaches. Coaches, they have kind of a sixth sense when it comes to sprinting. They've been looking at athletes run for their whole career. So they have an intrinsic knowledge about each athlete, how they run, what is the good factors, what is the bad factors. And we need to partner with people like that, get them into a setting like Rio Nagahara, and we need to do some good research. And we're basically minimizing the effect of, like, i.e. running on a treadmill, or kind of collecting something way out in the field that we are extrapolating again. So we kind of, we need to really come somewhere in the middle where we've got a good contextual area. We're working with applied individuals and kind of marrying those two components together. I think that's the way forward. And I think we could always do that better.
That sort of goes on to one of the questions we had for is, you mentioned coaches there. What do you think is the next breakthrough, or is there something coming that you see is going to really inform, practical changes in the sports performance realm, or are coaches already doing that and we just need to validate some of their ideas and maybe systematize the way that they're being applied, to different athletes and having approaches that allows it to be applicable across, say, slightly different profiles and things like that?
Yeah, and you kind of part answered that for me already, whereas I think coaches are the ultimate experts, especially obviously the top ones, for example, like Paul Pierce. I think they're already doing a lot of what they're kind of breaking the mold a little bit. They're working with scientists, they're working with other practitioners, they're open to ideas, they're trying new things. And us as researchers need to kind of step in there and go, okay, well, let's kind of distill what's changing and what's not changing, and let's answer this as well as we can. So what variables are changing? How can we measure it better? How can we report it better? So again, it's not a sexy answer, but it's one that I think will actually have significant benefits for the whole sprinting industry, is that if we can kind of really knock on the door of coaches, instead of us just kind of going, well, coaches, they're the applied guys, and if we can tell them what to do, we found this is what you should be doing. The coaches most of the time they go, we were doing that 15 years ago, just no one's published a paper on it. And you go, well, cool, I've wasted a serious amount of my life looking at this. So I think sometimes, coaches can be underestimated a little bit. I worked with Gary Bourne. I don't know if you're aware of him.
Gary,
so his son Matt Bourne, he's did his PhD kind of in the more biomechanics realm. So, I was working with him, and he has an unrivaled sense of what is mechanically happening during someone's jump. And, his biomechanics knowledge is all within his brain. And if we could just kind of get him to spill it out, so if Gary could just literally just sit down with a pen and paper for like a good hour, we would come up with probably 50 of the best research questions that need answering. And that's the way we need to do it, in my mind. Us researchers, we think because we use fancy technology and we code and we do all these kinds of things that we have the answers, but it's not really. We're the support act. We're really trying to help tease out what the coaches already know. So,
that's a really important, I think, principle that people forget about research, that typically research questions come from clinicians or coaches working in the field, making an observation, coming up with a theory, and then testing it. And look, I think perhaps in sports performance, it's probably better done where you see a lot more collaboration between researchers like yourself with coaches, where I find sometimes from the rehab perspective, a lot of the time researchers can be directing their research questions, which often aren't the kind of right questions we need to ask, or are misleading in terms of the application it has clinically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think, I think at the end of the day, you got to, I was working in applied sport for a good few years, but I am no longer in applied sport. I go and do research in applied sports. So I am no longer a person that should be getting asked what the specific research questions are within that. In my mind, I need to collaborate with coaches, and coaches may not always come up with the right research question, but together we can. So I can come up with the study design, the statistics that we should run, the methodology, all that kind of stuff. I can refine the research question, but ultimately the idea has come from the coach or the clinician. So I completely agree, because even when I was over East, I was also working in BMX freestyle as applied biomechanist, which odd one. I agree, but it was really interesting. But some of the common injuries we were seeing were lots of ACL ruptures, right? So how do you kind of marry the world of research where you see ACLs occurring in things like footy to something that's happening in like BMX freestyle? So myself and the physio that I was working with, I would often say, this is kind of what the literature is saying. What do you think about this? And he goes, yeah, but all the time. And because you'd say, yeah, but they don't actually do this, they do this instead. So it's kind of, I say this many times, that everything we do is basically just a small wedge in the pie, and we're just the support act for the clinicians or for the coaches, and the coach and the clinician actually need to make the decision. Us researchers don't make a decision as to when someone comes back from an injury, or if they have done really well in their performance. It's due to the athlete and the coach. So I think we're the support act, and we just need to remember that.
I wanted to ask you, this is an aside, but it's related to sprint performance. I know we get a lot of people listening because they're interested in sprint stuff. So I thought I would ask you, because I've got this question from a number of people recently. I was actually involved in I don't know what they called it, like a workshop sort of thing with the VIS, and they had a number of coaches from around the network in the institutes looking at sprint performance. And the one area of research that I think doesn't seem to have anywhere near the level of depth, and there's a scarcity of evidence, is on speed maintenance. What do you currently see as a biomechanist, some of the limiting factors for why people can or cannot maintain their speed once they've actually achieved maximal velocity?
Yeah, so you can look at it in kind of a couple of different ways. The first way would be, okay, from an overall perspective, whereabouts did you hit your maximal speed, and whereabouts did you lose your maximal speed? So that right there is more of a training question. Where are you currently training? Are you training more at the lower end? Are you doing lots of max velocity stuff and trying to hold that speed for a long period of time? So like a 400 meter runner, that's a really important question, is how early do you hit your maximal speed, and how long can you hold on to that for? So I think that's kind of like the kind of main holistic question. And then from a kind of more kind of narrowing it down to the actual sprint mechanics, is looking at what's actually changing when their speed is decreasing. So when I was working a lot with 400 meter runner or runners, we would look when they hit their maximum speed, and then we would look at things like what's happening with their stride frequency and stride length as that's dropping. Is it their legs turning over? Is it them kind of striding out a bit more and then reducing their stride frequency? So there's a couple of different factors from that, but I think when it comes to maintaining their speed, you should always be kind of looking back at that race perspective, so get that race profile, and then we can break that down into the smaller mechanical components of stride frequency and stride length. And I think from there, that gives us a steady focus for training. So speed maintenance is something that, you know, coaches have very differing opinions on.
That's why I'm asking, because people put these forward to me, and it always becomes this debate about how much of it's got to do with, you know, the bioenergetic input. You know, is it an energy system problem, or
Mhm.
is it a factor related to their mechanical understanding of what they're trying to do under some level of fatigue? And obviously there's a significant interaction between the two, as you said, in terms of their training process and where they're at and what kind of training they've been doing. But it's often been, I think, something that in Australia, and I say this because culturally I believe that we seem to be more influenced by the field sports and the Australian mentality, if you work hard, and people are very happy to do endurance type training, even in a sprint setting. And I will say, even at a global level, there are some coaches who have gotten away with getting very high levels of sprint performance out of athletes using much more of what you would consider, you know, a speed endurance type program rather than a very specific speed type program. You know, I think a perfect example that's probably thrown a spanner in the works after it seemed to have gone one way is Fred Curley, you know, claiming that he basically still was doing 400-meter type training and yet won a world 100-meter title. And people were like, oh, maybe you should be doing more, you know, 300 reps if you're a 100-meter runner. So I think that opened up that debate again. And I always have this conversation with people to say, well, you know, in my mind, particularly with something like 100 meters, energy systems probably plays a lot less part than you think. And it's more to do with how well do they understand the mechanical outputs that they need to maintain under an increasing level of fatigue. You know, and at least in my mind, I think that a lot of it's related more to the neurophysiology than it is actually to, you know, the energy system, you know, contribution at, say, peripheral tissue level. I don't know if you can comment on that, or if you think maybe I'm losing perspective, but I'd like your ideas on that.
Yeah, to be honest, you know, I think we tend to do kind of big circles, whether it's in the applied space or research as well. I think we're asking questions that are not new, and all it is that we kind of repackage them a little bit, and, you know, we kind of put a new word to it or whatever it is, but it's still something that has been looked at for many years, and yeah, I think speed endurance is kind of still the flavor of the month. So, you know, they're going to look at whether they're going to do that on grass or on, you know, track, whatever it may be. You know, there's differing opinions even on that. And I think the from an energy system perspective, you know, the 100-meter run is, or 100-meter sprint is completely different to running 300 or 400 meters. Go and watch a 400-meter athlete train, and then go and watch a 100 or even 200-meter athlete train. And you look at who is throwing up at the end of the session, and you get a good idea of which energy system is probably being tapped into most. So, yeah, I think there's something about actually training at max velocity for a given short period where you could look at it over a 30 or 40 or 50 meter period, and we want to look at the mechanical outputs of that, because at the end of the day, when you're sprinting at max velocity, you are restricted to your mechanical outputs that you are achieving. So, you know, is there a certain change in one of those mechanical outputs that is hindering you being able to keep that? And then therefore, that's probably what you should be focusing on, in my opinion, anyway. I don't think you should be blowing it out and doing, you know, a 400-meter sprint. But again, that's general. Each athlete's obviously quite different. So I think contextually, we obviously need to check whether that's appropriate for the athlete or not. But my personal bias, which may change, is, yeah, we want to focus on the kind of the mechanical outputs that they are hitting at that max velocity, and we want to see if there's any change in those mechanical outputs. Then we put our energy and focus into those ones as to whether we can change them or not, because, you know, there's certain parameters that are just morphological, they're anthropometric in nature, and you cannot change that. So you can maximize it, but
I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things that we wanted to ask you is, okay, and obviously you mentioned you worked in badminton, so it's obviously very different. But if you see something and you're working with the coach and you guys both, guys, girls, who think, okay, we need to make a change here. This isn't working for their outputs. Do you have an approach that you like to put into practice, with the performance team to say, okay, we're going to make change? You obviously just mentioned sometimes it's not even possible, but is there an approach that you like to take that it goes and works through?
Yeah, so I think first for me is always kind of going back to that first principles, and that helps you answer whether you can make a change. So whether it's morphological or anthropometrical in nature, going back to that first principles helps you identify that. I.e., if you look at something in sprinting, you go, okay, I want to look at their contact length. So what is their center of mass? How does that translate over the foot when they're in the ground contact period? That is pretty unchangeable. Yeah, that's got a lot to do with the length of your foot, the length of your leg. Okay, it's quite difficult to actually change someone's contact length without really doing some big mechanical changes. So if you kind of go back to first principles and someone wanted to look at something to do with the contact period, and you go, okay, well, one thing we cannot change is the contact length. What can we change? Well, we can probably influence the contact time. So is that going to help us to reach the goal? So I always want to go back to those first principles. That always helps you tick a box as to whether that's actually possible or not. So I'm, as I've mentioned previously in the podcast, I'm a big fan of knowing what you're measuring, and then from that we can help answer the question that we're trying to answer. So for example, in badminton, we wanted to go, all right, let's improve short serve accuracy in the lead up to the Rio Olympic Games for these badminton athletes. Okay, what is accuracy? Good question. So we had to start there. There was nothing out there that actually told us what an accurate serve was. It was all anecdotal. So, we had to literally strip it back to first principles and go, okay, well, it's a projectile. This is where it can land if it does land, but does it actually land? So you've kind of, again, gone back to the first principles. Okay, so we looked at how many of the recipients of the shuttlecock actually left it to just land on the floor. And I think it was less than 1%. So that was actually no longer a factor. So it was actually just what was happening over the net. So we needed to look at the apex position and the height over the net. So we kind of redefined what accuracy was, at least in that context. And then we could train for that. So we could literally use a constraints-led approach that got them to serve at particular apex positions and heights over the net. And we improved short serve accuracy. So I think that's kind of always my first approach is that kind of first principles, and then kind of peeling it back from there. So I hope that answers the question.
No, definitely. You mentioned then obviously some of those ideas about how you implement them, and a question that I'm kind of trying to wrap with, and we did speak to Jake about this, but I've seen through some of the institutes, them hiring positions for skill acquisition as a separate entity to biomechanics. How do you see the interplay between those? And do you think that there should be a separation, or is that actually in the wheelhouse of one or the other? Because I'll give you my opinion. I think that they actually should be done by a single person, because I think that that person probably does have the skills and or the opportunity to develop them if they haven't, because of their prior knowledge. How do you see that playing out? Because I've seen a couple of those jobs go up, and I've thought, okay, that's interesting that they're trying to separate that into, one being a skill acquisition person and one being a biomechanics. And to me, the overlap is quite vast.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. So we had the same thing at QAS. They were hiring Skillax, and I think maybe a way to kind of view it is Skillac and biomechanics are obviously separate entities, but the overlap is massive. So what we need to keep in mind is who and how many practitioners we have interacting with the coach and athlete pair, because as you would know as a coach, if you have 6 people busy going, I think this, and then we can measure this and I can do this, you're probably gonna say, okay, I don't want any of it. I think that at its fundamental level is probably an issue. So that's probably something that the institutes need to think about how they're going to do it. And I think one way to do it is, I think the skill acquisition experts, they could potentially work as in kind of more of a consulting role. So they maybe not the day-to-day stuff, but they could work with, have some individual sessions with coaches or maybe biomecs or whatever it is, and potentially have more of a crossover in that sense, rather than being on the ground at every session where biomecs are down there collecting data and things like that. Because at the end of the day, as a biomechanist working with a coach is essentially a skill acquisition specialist as well.
Yeah, exactly.
I was actually going to ask that. How does someone become a skill acquisition expert?
I don't know, they probably do a movement,
PhD in it, I guess.
So most will do some kind of research degree within skill acquisition. And then I think that's kind of where we need to go is think about the interaction with the coach, the athlete, and who's down on the ground with it. And like I said, I think the coach themselves are generally the skill-act person, right? So, me as a biomechanist, I can kind of go, look, this is what I'm seeing in terms of any of the outputs or measurements that we're doing. What do you think about that? Yep, this is what we want. How are we going to implement it? They will generally come up with their own constraints-led approach, or whether it's some kind of coaching cue or whatever it is, which is skill acquisition. So I do think there is definitely a space for it. I think it's just how we implement that space needs to be kind of ironed out. Because I did see a few coaches that were kind of a little bit overwhelmed with the number of support staff that you then have. Because at the end of the day, they're getting information from multiple different people, and they have to try and integrate and put this in together. And a lot of them, they've still got to go back to their full-time job. So, you really got to think about how we communicate and integrate that information into a coach's life and an athlete's life. So, I think we could definitely do that a lot better.
In terms of biomechanics, because I'm lucky enough to get support from some of the VIS staff with biomech, and funnily enough, I actually don't really like having them down that often, because I think it actually disrupts the flow of training quite significantly.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think that works? And do you think that, the integration of these kind of things needs to be done in a way where it's as little disruption as possible? Some coaches love it. Like one of our colleagues up in Sydney, I know, is actually basically got a biomech on track every single session. Which
I know who that biomech is as well.
Which, to be honest with you, I don't think that I could deal with as a coach. Like, I would get very frustrated with that. I think it has massive influence in a positive direction when it's used in sessions where that's the aim. You're trying to make biomechanical changes. But there are a lot of sessions where the aim of it is to actually complete the task based around the constraints that you've developed, maybe in conjunction with discussions with the biomech. But it's like, you actually need to go and do the task and practice this and go through your movement variability that is part of what we've designed, not stop every 5 seconds and, that data said this and this video looked like this and, the radar got this number. To me, that is all post hoc kind of, stuff that happens rather than in session. So do you maybe have some practical tips for me to help me out a little bit of like how I manage that? Because I find it difficult at times being able to manage, and the athletes get so excited, they go, the radar's out, this is here, we've got that. And it's like, stop looking at that shit and just actually get your training done.
Yeah, look, I don't think I need to give you any tips, to be honest. I think you have a method of working, and we need to work into that method of working. So if you do not want someone down there every session, that's what we need to do. So, I think you could be the greatest biomechanist of all time. You could be able to calculate things off the top of your head. You could collect all this data and be absolutely phenomenal, but the soft skills, the communication skills, the developing relationships, that's what's really important. So I think before we start ever collecting any data, my goal or tip for any future biomechanist out there was, you just go down and just watch and watch, ask questions when it's appropriate, kind of gain that rapport, and start to figure out how that coach actually likes to work. I had one coach that I worked with where we had multiple athletes in the group, and we had such a good relationship to the point where the coach would say, you can let's give the feedback to this one at this time. This one never gets feedback because the numbers just overwhelm this person. So that's the relationship that needs to be had, and where I have I think that's kind of where we as biomechanists probably lack a little bit in our training or our kind of ability to interpret a situation, is that we just haven't gone down there and spent the hours. And often, the institute is pushing. They're saying, you need to get down to sessions and you do all of these kinds of stuff and give back all this information to the coaches. But if the coach doesn't always want that, at the end of the day, the coaches are essentially our bosses, really, because that's what we're there to kind of provide a service to. So, my kind of tip would be get down there, get to know the coach, learn their coaching style, start to figure out the frequency and the information that they want to look at. Once you've kind of gained that rapport, then you can start to jump in a few questions or additional data points that you might want to look at, but it should not be data heavy. I think when we are collecting data, it should be periodic. And I don't think we should be out there really collecting data every single session. Like what I was doing a lot of the time was just standing out there with an iPad and help film, see what the coach is looking at, kind of give my 2 cents when required, build that rapport, and then kind of go from there. So I don't have any tips for you. I think you should just carry on doing what you're doing.
I think it's just one of those things that as a coach, I think you see things often in much larger time horizons as well. So, it's something that I recognized the other day, and it's not because I'm not extremely grateful, I am, but sometimes when you're working on something that that this sort of learning, timeline is going to be months, it really is not helpful to be providing data that's trying to create change from one rep to the next. Like you've designed this knowing that this person is young in their, say, technical development, and you have no belief that they're going to change this in one session. That it's going to be months of consistent practicing and playing with different cueing and playing with different tasks to develop that along with some of them. So obviously they're developing some of the actual physicals, capacities that they don't have, power and all those kind of things. So it's just one of those ideas that you have to make sure that you're providing both the athlete and obviously the people you're working with, the support staff, of an idea of like, this is what we expect, this type of change. If it happens sooner, great, but we shouldn't be forcing that because it's actually often not the case that it will be like that.
Yeah, and I think you've hit the nail on the head there. What you have is the practitioner, the biomech, whoever it is, the physiologist, whoever's working, and we have our own KPIs, which are often quarterly driven or yearly or half monthly driven. And if you're working with an 18-year-old, their sprint development doesn't sit in quarters or months.
Yeah.
You're looking at trying to get that person up to their peak level, in their like kind of early to mid 20s. So this is just the cycles that or like you said, the horizons that you're looking at are completely different. So unfortunately, I think for the practitioner, that's just a situation which you just have to figure out how to work with. So you've got to try and put in your KPIs that are required from the institute that still somehow marry up with the coach. So I think honesty is the best one, really, where I would talk to the coach, be like, look, this is the requirements of me. I know that those don't perfectly align with yours. How can I still be the best kind of, or provide you the best kind of service while still being employed and not getting fired? So I think honesty between the coaches is actually something that they really like. So if you keep coming out there and just going, I need to change this and I need to do this and I need to give you more data, I need to do that, that's when eventually where the coaches is going to be like, well, actually don't want you to come out to any session, and therefore you've lost the massive component of your service provider. So I couldn't agree more.
You just made me think of something, because we're talking about time horizons. And I have this discussion with people a lot around sprint performance. And I don't know whether you have an opinion on this, but do you see a difference in the biomechanical and, say, tissue properties development of different ethnicities of sprint athletes, and what those development curves look like? You know, every rudimentary analysis that I've done, which, as I said, is very rudimentary, it seems like Caucasian or Asian athletes can actually achieve a level of performance similar to people of West African descent, for instance, but it takes them a lot longer to develop, say, the physical characteristics that allow those West African athletes to be, say, as explosive or elastic as they are at very, very young ages. And I always think it's very interesting because, you know, and this is probably going to get me in trouble, but I feel like people that work in places like that, Athletics Australia, seem to struggle with the concept that a white athlete's not going to peak at 19 years of age versus, you know, an African-American athlete who's in college running 9.9. Our athletes don't seem to have the capability of getting there that soon. But do you see that there is differences in the development or because of some of these genetic components? And do we have to approach that differently in the way we look at time horizons for biomechanical or physical capacity development?
Yeah, it's funny because I guess it depends on the individual, because you often have some individuals, you know, that they hit this like performance and they'll hit this time and everyone will go, that's kind of next sprint, and then they never actually kind of amount to this next world superstar. So you know, obviously there is a genetic component to it. I think that obviously we know that obviously has a relative influence on your performance ceiling. So I think that does play a role. But you know, I think if we actually look at the history of training, the kind of cultural aspects as well is actually really important. So like, what are you exposed to from an early age? What kind of training are you doing? Are you doing any kind of training? You know, there's young athletes out there like Caleb Law, who's running really well. And how old is he now? 20, I think.
Yeah, about that, yeah.
And you know, he hadn't stepped inside a gym for regular periods. So, you know, and I think he's got a phenomenal potential career ahead of him. So who's to say just your kind of cultural background, or whether you're Caucasian or from West Africa, is going to influence your performance kind of goals and criteria and where you actually end up? Yeah, I think it probably plays a role, but it's probably not as a bigger role as maybe things like AA are putting onto it. So yeah, it's strange because we often did these kind of testing periods where we would bring in all these kind of like 15 to 18-year-old sprinters, and we'll do all these testing. We'll go, holy crap, did you see how good this kid was? And then 3 years later, nothing happened. So it's so individual. I wouldn't be able to kind of have you know, an idea as to say that these factors or these kind of components are actually going to lead to better development than one athlete over another. So yeah, if I was a betting man, I'd have probably lost all my money, to be honest. So
we won't hold you up too much longer, but we always like to ask our guests a question about something that maybe they're exploring or learning, or a new skill they've taken up that's probably not necessarily related to their, you know, professional work, but something that's kind of captured their interest.
Yeah, so this one actually does fall within kind of both spheres, because you know, I didn't realize it early in my career, but you know, data is a big part of our world, and I didn't realize how much I would actually enjoy kind of pulling and teasing things out of data that may or may not have meaningful interest. So I think, to be honest, that's if I have some spare time, what I'm actually doing is kind of like learning data science, to be honest. And that sounds boring and nerdy, and it is, but it is helpful for me for a career perspective as well, that I actually enjoy that. But yeah, I've probably been doing it now for the past 5 years just like coding in Python, kind of learning a whole range of things, whether you're going to build something in Python or if you're going to, analyze large data sets and kind of doing visualizations of data, but also, kind of from a statistics perspective, kind of refining that, learning how to apply the right statistics to the right bits of data and, kind of getting those methodologies down packed. So unfortunately, I'm not doing anything cool like skydiving or kite surfing or anything like that. I'll just do normal strength training and data science.
Yeah, very cool. Right.
Yeah.
Shayne, thank you so much for your time. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
To all of our listeners, do check out some of his research. Obviously, we appreciate you sharing, both your research knowledge and your investigations there, as well as, your practical coaching experience and biomechanical input as a support staff member for sports performance. So thank you so much, and we really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much. You two have been absolute gentlemen. It's been great. So thanks for having me on.
Thank you.